She called me on a Tuesday. I remember because I was watching the last period of a Leafs game. The sound turned low, a cup of tea going cold on the side table beside me. The phone lit up, and it was my daughter-in-law's name on the screen. I almost didn't pick up. "Dad, we need to talk." She always called me Dad. I never asked her to. She just started doing it after the wedding, and I never corrected her because in the beginning I thought it was affectionate. "We've already accepted an offer on the cottage. The buyers want possession by the end of March." I sat very still. "I'm sorry," I said. "The cottage, on Lake Muskoka. We listed it 3 weeks ago. The market was right and we didn't want to wait. You understand?" She said it the way you tell someone the subscription had been cancelled. Politely, efficiently, as though the conversation were already over. I asked her where my son was. "He's right here," she said. And then his voice, briefly in the background, "Dad, it's the smart move. We'll talk soon." Then she was back on the line. "So we'll be up to clear things out next weekend. If there's anything of your personal stuff still in the back bedroom, maybe you could arrange to have it picked up before then." I didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that she said "Dad" twice. "I'll call you back," I said, and I hung up. I sat in the dark living room in my house in Kingston for a long time after that. The lease lost, I didn't care. The cottage on Lake Muskoka had been in our family since 1987. I built the back deck myself with my late wife, Helen. We were in our early 40s, strong and stupid and happy, and we hauled the lumber up from the dock in July heat, and she handed me screws while our son, who was 4 years old, splashed in the shallows with water wings on his arms. We ate sandwiches on that deck for 30 years. We watched the northern lights from that deck. When Helen got sick, it was the last place she asked to go. My son Nathan grew up knowing that cottage the way you know your own heartbeat. Every summer, every long weekend in May, every Thanksgiving with the smell of wood smoke and the lake going gray in October. He proposed to his wife, Claudine, at the end of that dock. I was happy for him. I liked Claudine at first. She was sharp and organized, and she worked in real estate, which I thought meant she'd understand the value of things. I was wrong about what kind of value she understood. After Helen died, 3 years ago now, November, a Tuesday, everything bad in my life seems to happen on Tuesdays. Nathan and Claudine moved to a newer house in Oak Reel. Nice area. Big mortgage. From what I understood, though Nathan never said so directly. They had 2 children by then, my grandchildren Lily and James. I drove down every few weeks. I brought them maple syrup from a place near Perth, the real kind in the tin. James liked to pour it straight into his hand and lick it off. I didn't stop him. The cottage had always been in my name. Helen and I had never changed that, never thought to. Why would we? It was our place. Nathan was our son. We trusted him the way you trust your own hands. What I didn't know, until that phone call, was that 8 months earlier, Nathan had asked me to sign some papers related to the estate. It was after Helen passed, during a period when I was not entirely myself, and there were a great many papers. I signed them at the kitchen table while Claudine watched, and Nathan explained things quickly in the way he always does when he's nervous. I didn't read every line. I was 72 years old, and I had just buried my wife, and I trusted my son. One of those documents was a transfer of the cottage into both our names, mine and Nathan's, with a right of survivorship clause. I didn't know what I had signed. I thought it was part of the estate process, something to do with the will. What Claudine knew, and Nathan knew, was that with both names on the title, Nathan could list the property without my signature on the sale documents if he filed as a co-owner acting in the estate's interest. It was a legal gray area, a loophole their real estate lawyer had apparently identified. The offer had been accepted. The deal was conditionally firm. The cottage was, for all practical purposes, already sold. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Helen's chair by the front window, the one she used to read in, and I thought about the last time I'd been at the lake. It was September. I'd driven up alone, which I'd been doing more often because being there alone was somehow easier than not being there at all. I raked the leaves off the dock. I had a fire. I ate soup from a can and didn't feel sorry for myself, or tried not to. There was a box in the back bedroom, the one with the slubbed ceiling and the pine walls that Nathan used to sleep in as a boy. In that box were Helen's things. Not important things, not jewelry or documents, but the small things. A paperback she'd been reading the summer she got her diagnosis, a coffee mug with a loon on it that she bought at a gas station in Huntsville and used every single morning up there. A folded note she'd written me once when I came up a day later than her. I'd kept that note for reasons I couldn't explain to anyone. Claudine had told me to arrange to have my personal items picked up. I thought about that for a long time. In the morning, I called my lawyer. His name is Gerald, and we have known each other since our kids were in school together. He plays golf badly and laughs about it, and he is the most careful man I've ever met. I told him what had happened. I told him what had happened. I told him about the papers I'd signed. I told him about the sale. He was quiet for a moment. Do you still have copies of what you signed? I did not. All right, he said. Give me a few days. Those few days were the longest of my life, or close to it. Nathan called once on the Wednesday. He said he hoped I wasn't upset, that the timing wasn't ideal, but the market wasn't going to wait, that they needed the liquidity. That was the word he used, liquidity, to manage some things. He said he'd make sure I got my fair share of the proceeds. My fair share. I was 68 years old when I built that back deck. I was the one who had the well dug, who replaced the roof in 2003, who spent 3 weekends painting the boathouse because Nathan wanted it red. Helen had planted wild roses along the path to the water. They were still there. I told Nathan I'd heard him. I kept my voice very even. I did not tell him about Gerald. When Gerald called back on the Friday, his voice was different. Careful, in a new way. Okay, he said, here's what I found. It turned out I had signed a joint tenancy transfer. But, and this was the part Claudine's lawyer had apparently not checked carefully enough, the original title on the property had a restrictive covenant attached to it from the municipality, a clause from the 1990s related to waterfront zoning. That covenant required that any sale of the property to a third party be accompanied by a signed declaration from all original registered owners or their legal heirs, confirming the sale didn't violate the terms of Helen's estate. Helen's will had included a specific provision. She had written it herself with Gerald's help in 2019, 2 years before she got sick, when she was still sharp and thinking clearly. The provision stated that the Muskoka property could not be sold outside the immediate family without the written consent of both co-owners, and that in the event of a co-owner's death, immediate family was defined as blood relatives only. Claudine was not a blood relative. The buyer's own lawyer got it during title search. The deal collapsed on a Thursday morning, 10 days after that first phone call. Claudine called me that same afternoon. She was not warm this time. The sale fell through because of some archaic clause in your wife's will, she said. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. You knew about this, she said. I said, I knew about my wife's will, yes. There was a long pause. We're going to get this sorted out, Dad. There are legal ways to. My name is Lawrence, I said, and I think you should probably speak to Gerald from here on. I hung up. It was not over, of course. These things are never over quickly. Nathan hired a lawyer of his own, a younger man from a firm in Toronto, and there were several months of letters going back and forth. Gerald was calm throughout all of it. I tried to be calm too. Some days were easier than others. Nathan did not call me personally during that time. That was the part that I kept returning to in the evenings in Helen's chair, not the cottage. The silence from my son. He let the lawyers talk while I sat alone in Kingston, wondering if the boy who had once slept in that pine-walled room under a maple leaf pennant still existed somewhere inside the man who had tried to sell his mother's lake house without asking me. My granddaughter Lily texted me in March. She was 15 and she didn't know the details, but she knew something was wrong. She wrote, "Grandpa, are you okay? Dad is really stressed." I wrote back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't you worry about the grown-up stuff." She sent me a heart emoji, and I sat with that for a while. James, who was 12, sent me a voice message in April. He said, "Grandpa, when are we going to the cottage? I want to catch a bass this year." He sounded so much like Nathan at that age that I had to put the phone down and look out the window at the backyard for a minute. These things make it complicated. I want anyone reading this to understand that it was never simple. Nathan is my son. I loved him before he knew his own name. But love doesn't mean you hand someone the keys to everything and walk away. In May, Nathan's lawyer sent a formal proposal. Nathan would relinquish his claim to co-ownership in exchange for a cash settlement drawn from the estate's remaining liquid assets, meaning some of Helen's savings that had passed to me, which he apparently believed he had partial claim to under a different interpretation of the will. Gerald said the claim was weak, but not frivolous. He said we could fight it, or we could settle. I thought about it for exactly one weekend. On the Monday, I called Gerald and told him to counter with zero. Nathan got nothing from the estate savings. He could retain a one-time right to use the cottage for 2 weeks per year for as long as the grandchildren wanted to come. That was my offer, and it was the only one I would make. Gerald said, "You understand he might not accept." I said, "Then we go to court." Gerald was quiet. Then he said, "Okay, Lawrence." It took 3 more weeks, but Nathan accepted. The first weekend in June, I drove up to the cottage alone. It was a Friday, and I left Kingston at 6 in the morning while the streets were still empty and the sky was just getting pale in the east. I had the windows down and the radio off, and I thought about Helen most of the way, which is not unusual for me on that drive. I always think about her on that drive. The gate at the laneway was just as I had left it. The wild roses were coming in along the path. Leggy, a little overgrown, but alive. The dock needed a board replaced at the near end. I noted it. I'd get to it. I unlocked the back door and went straight to the back bedroom. The box was still there, pushed against the baseboard under the window. Nobody had touched it. I sat on the edge of the bed and I opened it. The paperback, the mug, the folded note. I unfolded the note. I had not read it in a long time. Helen had written it in her handwriting, which was small and slanted slightly to the right, and which I would know anywhere. It said, "I got here before you, and I've already claimed the good chair on the deck. You'll have to find your own. Love, H." I sat there with that note in my hands, for I don't know how long. The lake made its sounds through the screen window. A loon somewhere further out. The particular smell of water and pine and old wood that I have known for 40 years. When I finally went out to the deck we built together, Helen and I, in a July that felt like 100 years ago and also like last week, I sat in the good chair. Because it was mine now, and I was going to use it. I made tea. I watched the sun move across the water. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, something that would take time to name. But I was there, and the cottage was still mine, and the wild roses were still growing along the path to the water where my wife had planted them, and where they would grow for as long as I had anything to say about it. I thought a lot about what it actually takes to hold something together when the people closest to you are trying to pull it apart. It wasn't anger that saved me. Anger would have made me call Nathan that first night, say things I couldn't take back, blow up whatever was left of the relationship, and hand him a reason to paint me as the difficult one. I know myself well enough to know I was capable of that. I sat in Helen's chair in the dock, and I felt the anger move through me like weather. And then I let it pass. And in the morning, I called Gerald instead. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You start to understand the difference between what feels satisfying in the moment and what actually works. There's a kind of discipline in that Not the discipline of being cold or unfeeling, but the discipline of knowing when to be quiet and when to act, and understanding that those are two very different things. What Claudine counted on was that I wouldn't know my own documents, that I was too old, too grieving, too trusting to have paid attention. And she was partly right. I hadn't read every line of what I signed at that kitchen table, but I had spent 40 years building something with Helen, and part of what we built was careful. Helen's will wasn't an accident. She sat down with Gerard in 2019 while she was still well, and she thought it through. She anticipated the ways things can go sideways when money enters a family. That foresight, that quiet, unsexy act of planning was what protected us in the end. Not luck, not karma in any mystical sense. Just a woman who loved her family enough to think clearly about its worst possibilities. I keep coming back to that. It matters how you build things when everything is fine, because you don't get to build them once things go wrong. Nathan is my son, and I will love him until I can't. But I also know now that love without honesty is just a story you tell yourself. He let Claudine run that whole operation, and he stood in the background making vague apologetic sounds, and that was its own kind of choice. The people who do nothing while wrong things happen are not neutral. I had to understand that about my own son, and I won't pretend that was easy. What I want, if I'm honest, is for him to one day look back and recognize what he almost lost. Not the money, not the property, but the chance to be a man his own kids could be proud of. I don't know if that will happen. I can't control it. What I could control was how I carried myself through it, whether I acted with the kind of integrity that lets you sleep at night, whether I fought smart instead of just loud, whether I got back up after sitting in a motel in my mind, so to speak, and found my way back to the water. The board at the near end of the dock still needs replacing. I'll get to it this summer. Some things you just keep tending to, because they're yours, and because tending to them is the whole point.